Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Cropper, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And on behalf of the trustees of the gallery, I want to welcome you all to this, our 7th Wyeth Lecture in American Art. Over a decade ago, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art made a generous grant to the Center for the purpose of organizing a series of conferences and lectures on American art. The lectures happen every other year, and by inviting distinguished speakers, we hope to provide new insights into the field for a wider audience, including scholars just getting started in the field, as well as members of the gallery's interested public. Over the years, we've been able to expand the reach of these talks by providing podcasts on the gallery's website, and I'm happy to say that all 6 of the previous lectures are now online, and we look forward to keeping up with this practice, and we'll try and let you know when tonight's lecture is ready to go. Tonight's speaker, Kirk Savage, is a remarkable scholar, teacher, and colleague. After receiving his PhD at Berkeley, following undergraduate studies in mathematics and philosophy at Yale, he spent almost all of his career from 1990 on to the present at the University of Pittsburgh. His research over the years has taken him deeper and deeper into questions of race, memory, history, and memorialization, all subjects of enormous importance in the United States today. His first book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, Race, War, and Monument in 19th Century America, which was published by Princeton University Press in 1997, was awarded the prestigious John Hope Franklin Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. His second book, Monument Wars, Washington, D.C., the National Mall, and the Transformations of the Memorial Landscape, published by the University of California Press in 2009, was awarded the Charles C. Eldridge Prize by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, one of the greatest honors in the field, as well as a Wyeth Foundation publication grant by the College Art Association and the J.B. Jackson Prize by the Foundation for Landscape Studies. Here at CASVA, we've been very lucky to have Kirk as a member of our selection committee for the Fellowship for Travel Overseas for graduate students in American art. Most recently, he served as a scholarly editor of our symposium volume, The Civil War in Art and Memory, the publication of a scholarly meeting held at the time of the gallery's exhibition around the Shaw Memorial, to which he also made an important contribution. The volume should appear in the early spring, and I hope some of you have had a chance to see the dust jacket outside. I've described Kirk's work as deep, which it is, but it's also extraordinarily broad. I think it's safe to say that he knows more about Civil War monuments than any other single person in the United States. But he's also embraced the role of public intellectual to comment with frequency online in the most informed way on issues having to do with the commemoration of war in general, of racial divides, and also the aftermath of the Civil War. He has a great deal to say about our city and its long history, much of it in danger of being forgotten. Kirk Savage is quite simply an essential resource for our time, and we're deeply grateful to him for agreeing to deliver this Wyeth lecture on the art of the name, soldiers, graves, and monuments in the aftermath of the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Kirk Savage.
I want to make sure the people in the front rows can see me. All right. Is that what everybody can see me now? Okay, great. All right. I'll make sure. And can you all hear me fine now? Great. So everyone in this room has probably had the experience of wandering through an older U.S. city and stumbling into the beguiling fiction of a so-called rural cemetery, with its vast collection of gravestones and tombs and miniature temples interspersed among rolling hills, woods, and vales. Its highly manipulated natural, quote unquote, natural landscape is an outdoor museum in more ways than one, yet with a striking difference. The objects that surround us here in this beautiful museum are lovingly and superbly conserved, as if they were all made yesterday or teleported miraculously from every age of the past into our present. But even in the greatest rural cemeteries like this one, Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh, both the passage and the pressure of time are everywhere visible. The residues of past eras coat the graves in factory smoke and coal dust. The stone and metal erode and weather and stain. Slabs tilt and sometimes fall into the ground. And by the way, this is not what every grave in Allegheny Cemetery looks like, but many of them do show this kind of wear. Images dissolve before our very eyes, and even the very names of the dead, the whole reason this elaborate above-ground apparatus has come to be, even these often disappear. As Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote about his local graveyard in Cambridge, Mass., the slumberer's mound grows fresh and green, then slowly disappears. The mosses creep, the gray stones lean, earth hides his date and years. These decaying monuments have what Riegel called age value, allowing them to trigger metaphysical ruminations like Holmes's. Yet in the cemetery, that age value comes into conflict with the need to commemorate and to preserve, to keep the name alive, as the ancient Egyptians used to say. As Jan Assmann has taught us, this imperative to preserve the name is the foundation of mortuary culture. In the midst of this rural cemetery's picturesque decay is a radically different landscape. A level field occupied by an orderly array of nearly identical, clean, white headstones set upright at a uniform height in perfectly aligned rows. Where the cemetery around it seems haphazard, diverse, and idiosyncratic, this particular lot down in the so-called flats, as they call them, is a much more obviously regulated and uniform landscape. The gleaming marble stones catch the surrounding light and throw into sharp relief the raised letters of the names, which, it soon becomes apparent, are the defining focus of this installation. In the center of the plot of 300 graves is an eroding sandstone war memorial from the 1870s, a monument to the Union dead, complete with standing soldiers overseen by a female allegory, looking obsolete and decayed, even though it actually postdates the layout of the plot and most of the graves within it. After the Civil War, soldier monuments and soldier cemeteries sprung up en masse for the first time in the United States and indeed in the Euro-American world, even though there was no shortage of earlier war dead from the always violent American past. As Holmes wrote about his own churchyard in the 1830s, the Indian's shaft, the Briton's ball, the saber's thirsting edge, the hot shell shattering in its fall, the bayonet's rending wedge. Here scattered death, yet seek the spot, no trace thine eye can see, no altar, and they need it not who leave their children free. Despite that amazing image of the ground beneath him full of bodies punctured and rent and shattered by war, the traces of that violence had become invisible and even unwanted in the relatively brief time of peace in which Holmes wrote. An interregnum of just about 3 decades, as it turns out. The true monument to the war dead, he thought, resided invisibly in that state of freedom that the war dead had supposedly secured. This anti-monumental sentiment fell on deaf ears after the Civil War, when soldier monuments and cemeteries spread across the land from battlefields to hometowns. When I rediscovered Allegheny Cemetery's little soldier plot about 3 years ago, I was struck anew by the disparity between the monument and the graves, their design and arrangement appearing so much at odds with the antiquated memorial in the center and with the aging tombs from various eras scattered nearby. I learned the monument was a homegrown undertaking, sponsored by a local ladies' memorial association, but the plot itself was a federally owned soldier's lot, a federal cemetery within a municipal one. It is one of 22 such soldiers' lots in the national cemetery system. And of course, there are soldier cemeteries like Antietam and so on. These particular, what they call soldier lots, are these smaller lots within larger cemeteries, usually municipal cemeteries. So it's one of 22 of these lots in this national cemetery system that was born in the Civil War, the first instance in the modern world of a nation systematically assuming responsibility for its soldier dead. While there were precedents for this system in the ancient world, the best known being the cemetery in Athens, where the cremated remains of soldiers who had died abroad were brought back for collective burial, the American system promised its war dead individual burial of intact bodies, a logistical goal of impossible proportions that would have profound ripple effects throughout U.S. society. The federal soldier lot in Allegheny Cemetery is about 50 yards away from another soldier lot, often confused with it. This second lot once belonged to the most powerful civic association in the United States, the Union Veterans Organization, called the Grand Army of the Republic. And in its heyday, this burial ground here was larger and far more popular and prestigious than the government lot. It too is arrayed in neat straight rows, but the headstones, originally upright, have been pushed over into the ground. The stone turned gray, the names in most cases completely unreadable. The first lot looks almost magically untouched by time, the second so degraded by time that it has lost even its age value and is now a mere wreck, disappearing into the ground with the bodies it is supposed to commemorate. These striking disparities are symptomatic of a much larger problem, what I will call the metadata crisis of the war dead. Metadata in the broadest sense is data about data, but more specifically, metadata is the term that librarians and catalogers use to refer to various categories of information, such as name, title, and date, that describe and identify objects like books and artworks that are rich in information. Metadata is the foundation of art history. Without all the elaborate procedures devised to date artworks and make attributions, art history would be impossible. Metadata must be attached to its object in some way, typically in the form of a label or a barcode or a mark stamped or cast or simply written directly on the object. Anyone who has gone through a collection of old family photographs of long dead ancestors has probably had the experience of turning over an unknown image, hoping to find some sort of metadata handwritten on the back. A mere surname or set of initials can not only identify a face, but unlock an entire life story. And in this case, by turning over the back, my wife and I were able to discover also that this photo was taken by probably the most famous post-war photographer in Gettysburg. Grave markers, headstones, headboards, inscribed rocks are among the most ancient, culturally significant forms of metadata. Both the national cemetery system and the proliferation of war memorials were responses to a metadata crisis, not unlike the example of the forgotten family photograph, but intensified at a shocking scale. That crisis was quite simply the separation of names from bodies, repeated endlessly and everywhere. It was not merely a logistical crisis, but an identity crisis that rippled through families and communities and polities alike. Keeping the name alive, or keeping the name in place, a slightly different formulation that I will explain in just a moment, was a cultural problem, a technological problem, and an artistic problem, all wrapped in one enormous undertaking. Art history, I hope to show, offers some unique insights into this multifaceted undertaking that reshaped the nation in ways we have not yet fully grasped. During the Civil War itself, the names of the dead seemed ever present, carried by telegraph and news media into homes everywhere. Detached from their bodies and from the horrible realities of warfare, these names settled into alphabetized lists, arrayed in columns like the passenger manifests from ships in port or the dead letter lists from the post office. Quote, "We see the list in the morning paper at breakfast, but dismiss its recollection with the coffee," commented the New York Times after the horrific Battle of Antietam in 1862. And I'll go on and quote this at length because it's really an amazing paragraph. "There is a confused mass of names, but they are all strangers. We forget the horrible significance that dwells amid the jumble of type. Each of these little names that the printer struck off so lightly last night, whistling over his work, and that we speak with a clip of the tongue, represents a bleeding, mangled corpse. It is a thunderbolt that will crash into some brain, a dull, dead, remorseless weight that will fall upon some heart, straining it to breaking. There is nothing very terrible to us, however, in the list, though our sensations might be different if the newspaper carrier left the names on the battlefield and the bodies at our doors instead." We could spend the entire evening talking about this one paragraph, with its modernist recognition of the numbing effect of mass media, and with its strange juxtaposition of the remorseless weight of death with the light-hearted routine of the printer who strikes off the name of death's latest victim, his alienated labor so different from the elaborate rituals of a funeral or the arduous craft of carving the same letters into a tombstone. And then, an even more striking disjunction, the detachment of names from bodies. Our sensations might be different if the newspaper carrier left the names on the battlefield and the bodies at our doors instead. What a remarkable idea. It came to the writer because she or he had experienced for the first time the new technology of battlefield photography, specifically an exhibition of grisly images of corpses taken on the battlefield of Antietam and displayed in Matthew Brady's gallery in New York. If we parse all that is implied by this short paragraph, the disjunctions multiply in a dizzying sequence. The names of these corpses passed through the fingers of a typesetter and floated on lists in hometown newspapers in, say, Vermont or North Carolina, while miraculous visual transcriptions of the bodies traveled to Matthew Brady's gallery in New York City. And meanwhile, the bodies themselves were dumped in a mass trench on a farm in Maryland. Names, images, and bodies all moved in different directions and mostly among strangers. During the Civil War, these new print and image technologies combined with concentrated mass warfare to exacerbate an already bewildering metadata crisis. Life in the 19th century was not supposed to end this way, in a disrupted burial far from family and community. For slaves, paupers, and criminals, such disruptions were commonplace. But white citizens and their families expected the privilege of a so-called good death at home and a properly marked grave registered in a cemetery. And for these more privileged members of society, the Civil War came as a profound shock, as scholars such as Drew Gilpin-Faust have taught us. The Christian doctrine of resurrection did offer real consolation by promising the body's return, no matter what displacements it had endured in life and death. But this promise of return in the hereafter did not by any means eliminate the overwhelming need of families, communities, and ultimately the nation itself to stay connected in the here and now to the bodies and names and identities of the dead. As one grieving woman wrote in early 1865, Oh, would I could say from the bottom of my soul truthfully, thy will be done, but I fear I never, never can. She was talking about her beloved who had died and been buried by her. It was precisely in this gap between God's perfect world in the future and the tragic world of the here and now that art and technology worked, meeting the pressing needs of the war's survivors. The problem posed by the war dead was a problem of displacement, of death out of place. On a scale unprecedented in U.S. history, the Civil War led to a massive physical displacement of bodies in life and death. A soldier off a farm in the middle of the country might die on a battlefield in Virginia, or a prison camp in Georgia, or a hospital here in Washington. As shattering as these circumstances were, they were often compounded by a second displacement, a metaphysical displacement of the body from its name. In literally hundreds of thousands of cases, soldiers became unknown or missing. The unknown were bodies that had lost their names. The missing were names that had lost their bodies. In both cases, the metadata, the name, had become detached from its object, the body. These legions of the unknown and the missing were two sides of the same coin. The metadata crisis created by protracted mass warfare between armies, totally unprepared for human disaster on this scale. The signs of this crisis were almost everywhere and were dealt with in sermons, speeches, editorials, graveyards, town greens. Families, contractors, military and philanthropic agencies all made unprecedented efforts to find bodies and reconnect them with names. In the weeks and months after Gettysburg, for example, the battlefield was overrun with people searching through grave sites, sometimes opening up graves and rummaging through personal effects that had already been picked over by enemy soldiers or civilian scavengers. They were in search of any object that might yield identifying information, a letter, a small Bible, a receipt, a family photograph tucked in a pocket. And you have to remember that this was long before there was a dog tag system in place that could guarantee the identity of the dead. After the war, the Federal Army set in motion a vast enterprise to scour the theater of war for bodies, while the legendary nurse Clara Barton established an office of correspondence with the Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army and received over 63,000 letters inquiring after lost men. Charitable organizations such as the Christian Commission financed trips to makeshift cemeteries in prison camps and battlefields where they copied metadata from wooden headboards and published it in long lists of names in books, quote, given in the order in which they lie. All these people and agencies were racing against the destructive effects of time. When graves were marked, the fragile wooden headboards quickly decayed, and the marks on them, often in pencil, simply faded away. In other cases, as the Christian Commission's report noted, the headboards disappeared or were found somewhere else, detached from their graves, a label without an object. In the cemetery for Union soldiers who died at Richmond's notorious Libby prison, less than 1 in 20 graves were marked. The remaining headboards had been taken by poor people in the neighborhood and incinerated to heat their homes. Headboards, like the bodies which they marked, decomposed and were lost. For this reason, Samuel Weaver, a contractor hired to identify and rebury bodies in the Gettysburg area several months after the battle, made a point of nailing headboards at once, as he said, to their new coffins so that headboard and body would never be separated again. But this was not enough. He also wrote the name, regiment, and company of the soldier on the coffin itself and numbered the coffin, then recorded all that metadata in a daybook he kept with him, which you see he's holding in his hand, later copying the names and numbers to a master register. There is very little imagery of this massive national campaign to synchronize the war dead with their names. understandably because the process was at once so abstract and so mundane, metaphysical in its reach and yet grisly in its details. Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs of disrupted Confederate burials at Gettysburg are some of the few images that open insight into this process. These are among a handful of photographs produced during the war that show the wooden headboards made by soldiers sharply enough to read the lettering under magnification. In this case, the glass plate negative, which survives, enables us to identify the soldier on the far left by a mere 5 characters of metadata, TWS on the top line and E3 on the line below it. It is amazing, first of all, that the dead soldier's comrades took the time, this is on the second day of the battle, before the battle had concluded, that they took the time during the deadliest battle of the Civil War, while the outcome was still undecided, to do their best to imitate tombstone carving by carefully incising and beveling the honorific font in this board. They didn't have the time to carve the whole name, but they didn't need to, because the 3 initials and the military shorthand were just enough data to point to an actual individual. Thomas W. Sly of the 3rd South Carolina Infantry, Company E. And perhaps most remarkable of all, we have a memoir written by a fellow soldier where this individual body, identified by 5 characters, comes back to life in a flood of words. He resurfaces in the memoir as a bright young college student who left school and became a favorite with the troops. Witty and always kind, but rather girlish in appearance, for physically he was not strong, to quote from the memoir. For this reason, the memoir explains, his officers took pity upon him and assigned him to duties in the rear, away from combat. When he got to Gettysburg, however, Sly burst into tears and begged to be allowed to prove his manhood in battle. So on July 2nd, 1863, this witty, kind, teary-eyed, girlish young man marched through a peach orchard into a hail of bullets and died defending the Confederate nation's cause. That cause being, to quote from its own mission statement, its constitution, the right of property in Negro slaves. The metadata on the Sly headboard survived several exhumations and removals and ended up in revised form on an elaborately carved gravestone in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, where Sly's body was relocated in 1871 through the efforts of the Ladies Memorial Association of Charleston. The Charleston group was one of the best known among many elite white women's associations organized to care for Confederate graves and to bring back the bodies of Confederate soldiers to Southern soil. Sly's body is in a collective grave of some 9 bodies, no doubt because the remains of the men became intermingled during reburial by a farmer at Gettysburg. On the Magnolia tombstone, Sly becomes an officer, a sergeant, which he never was in reality, and ironically, due to a mistranscription, his name acquires a T, becoming Slythe. The relief sculpture by an unknown stone carver relies on a traditional pictorial vocabulary of resurrection with a winged female figure standing in for the Ladies Association, crowning with laurel the reclining figure of a dying officer, his status identified by his sword. In this gender binary, it is the female figure and the ladies she represents who have the agency, and the male figure who has lost it. But in this apparent reversal lies the reestablishment of traditional hierarchies, since the pose of the dying man unmistakably evokes the deposition of Christ, and in turn, the soldier's Christian sacrifice and ultimate redemption for the cause of white supremacy. Now it is almost impossible to gaze on Thomas Sly's gravestone without thinking of the Emmanuel AME church massacre that took place in June, only 5 miles from this grave. To restore Thomas Sly to his native land and a place of honor there, the ladies of Charleston had to go beyond simply keeping his name alive, which they almost failed to do because of the misspelling. They had to put his name back in the place of his body. In a cemetery, the metadata above ground stands on its own, while below ground, the body that data describe literally falls apart silently and invisibly. The lady's tombstone took its power and authority from the implied presence of Sly's body below ground, but at the same time, the stone erased his personal life story and buried it beneath their own gendered narrative of heroic male sacrifice for the master race. Sly's name and his life were consumed by his death and by the new place his death reserved for him in the Confederate cemetery. Art history offers us a way of describing and understanding this process of replacement, but it must do so in dialogue with a history that is quite literally from below, the distinctive life stories that are buried beneath the names so artfully represented above. If we ignore the stories below the names, then we will never understand the peculiar power of the soldier cemetery to reshape individual lives and to remake the larger collective narratives that citizens in turn live by. This should become clearer if we move away from the conventionalized gravestone imagery exemplified in Sly's tombstone to the severe, minimalist vocabulary of the federal soldier cemeteries, where the highly uniform arrangements and stripped-down headstones create the appearance of an unsentimental, egalitarian, and functional metadata. Even here, perhaps especially here, there is a powerful artistry at work, which reframes and ultimately obscures the messy human history below. The Soldiers' Lot in Allegheny Cemetery looks like a miniature version of Arlington National Cemetery and does share with it certain distinctive design features. Like Arlington, the lot is so beautifully maintained that it seems to exist outside time or in an eternal present. When I first saw the shimmering marble gravestones, I was amazed at their state of preservation until I realized, of course, that they had been replaced probably multiple times in the same style so that their age wouldn't show. I recently stumbled across an example of an original federal gravestone, probably dating to around 1910, in a very old defunct cemetery dripping with age value. Its gray, cracked surface slowly being covered by algae and lichen, and the lettering of the name J.A. Powell disappearing to erosion. One of the remarkable aspects of the National Cemetery System is that it reached into obscure little graveyards like this one all across the United States. The system was expanded to include not only the war's dead, but its survivors, its veterans, who became eligible for a standard issue federal headstone no matter when or where they were buried. In Powell's case, the decaying stone was the only federal headstone in this ancient, truly rural cemetery that now finds itself on the edge of a railroad line in the shadow of one of U.S. Steel's last working plants in western Pennsylvania. If Powell's lone federal grave seems displaced by industrialization and abandonment, the graves in the soldier lot seem much more in their proper place, even though, ironically, the men who ended up there had much less connection to the place than Powell had to his. The headstones in the soldier lot carry this kind of presence, not only because they are in better condition, but because they belong to a collective of soldiers with a very strong, visible organization. At first glance, from a distance, their collective layout might appear to be a grid, but soon enough it becomes apparent that a different organizing principle is at work. A grid is a network of intercrossing lines that creates squares. Here the stones are aligned in one direction only, basically north-south. Yet that one directional alignment takes the form of perfect rows, just like the line formation of soldiers in classic mid-19th century military practice. Handbooks of battle tactics from the Civil War era made a fetish of alignment. They present incredibly minute instructions for how to discipline bodies so that they can step into precise lines, elbow to elbow, without turning their heads or shifting their shoulders. Diagrams map out the complicated maneuvers by which various groups of men were supposed to pivot themselves into these long, exacting lines. It seems obvious that this seductively intricate geometry of alignment was a Platonic ideal imposed on the chaotic reality of bodies in combat. In a similar way, the perfect alignments in the cemetery lot imposed a military discipline on the underlying reality of bodies in decomposition. And that discipline extended to the ground and the stone as well, but not to the geese who were competing with me that morning that I was out photographing. The earth, which in the cemetery was usually mounded and uneven, had to be graded and leveled. To make a perfectly straight row required planarity. The headstones had to be reset and cleaned periodically. In recent years, the stones have been set into gravel, as you see here, so that they will settle evenly at the same height and grass will not stain them. If it took a keen architectural craftsmanship to align the stones, it has also taken thought and work to keep them that way, to keep the unruly natural landscape surrounding the graves from interfering with their man-made discipline. The other organizing principle of the graves is uniformity. And here, the disciplining of stone becomes crucial. Just as the nation needed a mass army of men, the government in charge of burying those men needed a mass production of gravestones. The old artisanal system of hand-carving gravestones in small shops would not do when literally hundreds of thousands of gravestones were needed across the national cemetery system. In the 1870s, a new mass production system had to be invented out of whole cloth. Standardization and minimalism were necessary to make the new system work. The more data included on the gravestone, the more expensive and time-consuming its production would be. The homilies and biographical details of family gravestones were out of the question. As in the wooden headboards carved hastily on the battlefield, only a minimal number of characters could be accommodated in the sandblasting process that was pioneered for the marble headstones. The sparse data was spelled out in iron type and glued to the surface of the stone, which was then sandblasted, leaving the letters and numbers in high relief. A simple shield motif to indicate that the deceased was a defender of the nation, and if known, the individual's name and his regiment, heavily abbreviated, to situate him within the military structure that now claimed his body in death. That was all the process would allow. If the process appeared to be egalitarian, literally blasting away distinctions of rank, it also blasted away much of history. In the Allegheny Cemetery soldiers' lot, about 2/3 of the graves are Civil War soldiers. But there is nothing to distinguish them from soldiers of earlier wars who are also in the lot, or to distinguish the wartime dead from survivors who died later. The grave of a soldier who fought in the war that ended slavery, Vernon Johnstone, you see here on the left, lies next to the remains of a soldier, William Blakely, who died in Mexico in a war to expand the territory of slavery. Yet their headstones give no indication of this. A half-dozen Confederates who died in Pittsburgh as prisoners of war were buried within the lot next to Union soldiers in the shadow of a Union War Memorial. Not until 1907 did they get a headstone marked with the initials CSA. And this one for Alfred Alcorn. Alcorn's story is particularly amazing because he was a prisoner of war who was en route from one prison in Ohio to another one in Maryland, and he jumped the train in Pittsburgh and died of head injuries. And that's why he ended up here. In the soldier lot, causes do not register, neither the moral causes for which the men died, nor their physical causes of death. Here they are all unified in one organization and one cause, the cause of the nation. Only in the 20th century, when the lot was reaching capacity, did the metadata begin to expand as death dates and the name of the war occasionally appeared on the newer gravestones. It's as if the curators of a museum made the radical decision to remove the dates from their object labels to send a message about the universality of art. As all curators know, the choice of metadata, what to include and what to suppress, matters deeply. We should think of the soldier lot then as a heavily curated installation where many aspects of design and interpretation come together to erase personal and political history. The lot thrives on a strong collective organization of the dead across more than a century of wars, on systematic maintenance to keep the effects of time and age at bay, and on a near total absence of temporal metadata. It's hardly surprising that intellectuals and artists would come to prefer this spare, laconic, military aesthetic to the undisciplined hodgepodge that the rural cemetery had become. Born of necessity, the soldiers' cemetery did indeed innovate a new kind of artistry, profoundly selective and seductive in its expression of order and common purpose. A history from below, however, reveals an alternate reality that belies the seductive impression of system and unity above. That history must start with the lot itself, which it turns out has its own complicated and checkered story. The soldier lot at Allegheny Cemetery seemingly began in 1862 with a simple mission to bury free of expense, according to its board, such persons as may have died or may die in defense of our country in the present war, unquote. The reality of the lot is far more complex, however, starting with the fact that very few men buried there actually fit that description. 10 years after the lot was established, only about 200 men had been buried in it, while hundreds of other Civil War soldiers occupied the same cemetery in family plots or elsewhere. So we have about 200 soldiers in the soldier lot, and we have up to 1,000 other Civil War soldiers elsewhere in the cemetery. Why did these 200 men end up in this soldier lot? Where did they come from? When I started the project, I imagined them as Western Pennsylvanians who had died in the field in Tennessee or Virginia and had their remains brought home, as Thomas Sly's were to South Carolina or the Athenians were to Athens. In fact, less than a tenth of the Civil War dead in the soldier lot died in the field of battle injuries. The rest of them, like most of those lost throughout the war, died of disease, a result of poor sanitation, overexposure, or simply contagion. These were not the relatively few like Sly who expired on the field of honor, but men who died in lonely suffering, away from their family, friends, and regiment, displaced even from the redemptive narrative of male valor. Most surprisingly of all, for a majority of these men, the cemetery was not a return home. They ended up in the lot because they happened to die nearby. In fact, they died in one specific place, a building located less than 2 miles from the cemetery gates. During the war, this was the U.S. military hospital in Pittsburgh, a major collection point for men who came there from starting points across the Union. And many, in fact, were born in Europe, in Ireland, Germany, and elsewhere. Their burial in the soldier lot was a matter of simple logistics, not personal choice or connection. After the war, this hospital was converted to a rest home for veterans with tuberculosis and other diseases, and for a number of years, these were the men who filled the new graves in the soldier lot. Almost all these men had endured multiple displacements in life and in death. What united them was not dying in defense of their country, but the happenstance of having died alone and penniless in one particular spot. The original soldier lot in Allegheny Cemetery, where these men were initially buried, was in fact little more than a potter's field. It was located up in the so-called stranger's ground, where those without money or kin were put. And this, of course, is a very recent photograph of the stranger's ground. Most of that field you see is actually occupied by unmarked graves. And I have no photographic documentation of the stranger ground in the 19th century at all. So I don't know exactly where the soldiers were buried or how it looked. But the federal lot we see today down in the flats is not this original lot. The true origin story of the federal lot is a traumatic event that took place in a military camp just outside Pittsburgh, a draft rendezvous, as they called it, known as Camp Copeland. The men who died there in the early weeks of 1864 were draftees, fresh from their homes, who got caught in terrible waves of disease that spread through the camp because of miserable conditions and poor medical care. And this is just the first page of a long death register from that camp from the first 2 months of that year. The men were hastily buried in a field outside the camp, just as they would have been after a battle. 4 years later, the Army, in response to its national mandate, retrieved the remains, identified them as they could, and reburied them in Allegheny Cemetery. Not, however, in the cemetery's original soldier lot up in the stranger's ground, but in a second, brand new lot located down in the flats, the one we see today. In 1874, the government decided to combine the two lots into one, digging up the bodies in the older lot, along with some other soldier graves scattered throughout the cemetery, like the Mexican-American War graves, and reburying them all in a new arrangement with a new numbering system in the government lot. The final displacement of the dead in what was for most of them a long history of displacements. Yet this new lot was still by no means what it looks like today. And again, I have no image here to show you because the imagery doesn't survive. To begin with, the graves were unidentified when the second lot, the new lot, was first made. They were simply mounds of dirt and gravel, unmarked except for wooden headboards bearing only a number, not a name. Initially, the visiting public assumed that the men buried there were unknown dead. Imagine the surprise then, sometime perhaps in the early 1880s, when some 200 marble gravestones suddenly appeared, all but 9 of them with names. In a single stroke, the gravestones gave almost 200 men individual identities, as well as a collective identity, because the gravestones created a highly visible organization for them. We don't know exactly what that looked like in its original form. We do know that the lot sometimes suffered from poor maintenance and that the headstones were not as uniform as they are today. As you can see from this 1934 photograph, the slight differences in size and shape of some of these earlier headstones, like this one here, do change the overall effect significantly. Even as these men acquired nominal identities, however, we may well wonder what those individual names signified. What use is a name on a gravestone when no one coming to the cemetery recognizes it? It may as well be unknown. In some cases, we know that families were looking for the men in some cases we know that families were looking for the men, but the names on the headstones were simply wrong, incorrectly transcribed from previous headboards or death registers, as Thomas Sly's name had been. E.Z. Hall, for instance, became E.Z. Hale on grave number 154, until a descendant 140 years later, this was just about 3 or 4 years ago, discovered the mistranscription and restored his family name. You see with the newer issue headstone here. Hall's story is one of the strangest in the soldier lot and one of the very few who died in combat. He was a volunteer from Michigan who died of his wounds in 1864. His remains were sent back home by train from a military hospital in Washington, D.C. The train in those days to Michigan made a stop in Pittsburgh. And there the passengers demanded that his decomposing body be removed from the car. The railroad company delivered the corpse and what little information it had to Allegheny Cemetery, where E.Z. Hall, in effect, died a second death from the displacement of his body and the misspelling of his name. While Hall's case was extreme, in many others, poor communication or lack of nearby kin meant that nobody knew who these names were. They were mere placeholders in a military organization with no other information that might sum up a life story, simply generic conscripts in an army of the dead. Some of them escaped this fate, however. In about a dozen cases, when there were kinfolk who knew the men, they pulled them out of the soldier lot and had them reburied in their own local cemeteries. The Grand Army of the Republic, as we have seen, created its own separate soldier lot with its own corporate identity. It followed exactly the same design principles of the federal lot, but shifted the orientation of its rows to make the distinction visible. So these rows are east-west, whereas the rows in the federal lot are north-south. For many years, while the organization was in its heyday, the lot was more tightly organized and maintained than the government lot. The men in the GAR lot chose to be there, and their makeup was more representative of the Union Army in one key respect. Almost 20% of them came from the U.S. colored troops, whereas in the government lot, to the best of my knowledge, not a single Civil War soldier was African American. And I still don't know exactly why that is the case, but I suspect that there is segregation at work. There was only one way to know this, though, to know the identities of these men. Only one way to come to know anything significant about the names in the federal soldier lot, and that was through the metadata left off the gravestones and buried in the archives of the cemetery in its interment registers. And I have spent a long time, as you probably can tell, I've spent a long time in these interment registers, all on microfilm. The history from below I've been trying to reconstruct is also a history from the back office. Clerks in that back office, working from daily reports made by the foreman, entered each body into a huge register book as the bodies came into the cemetery, and assigned each entry a unique number in one long sequence, starting with number 1 for the very first body buried in the cemetery in 1845. It took me a while to realize that this interment register was exactly like a museum accession list, where the objects accessioned were people's bodies. Ironically, no such accession records exist for the valuable artifacts above ground, the gravestones, sculptures, and architecture that make the cemetery an outdoor museum. This is the main reason I've had to make guesses about the history of the gravestones. They simply aren't documented. The bodies, by contrast, are documented to an extraordinary degree. The interment number, I'm sorry, the cemetery is very protective for for some understandable reasons about the information in the interment register. So they did very kindly give me this little slice of one of the entries, who's actually the very first Civil War soldier buried in the soldier lot, the original one that was up in the Stranger's Ground. The interment number given to each body was keyed to a whole series of metadata fields about the identity and history of the person, including, for example, place of birth, cause of death, and beginning in the 19-teens, a field for the person's color, quote unquote color. Through this hidden information, the outlines of a biography can begin to appear. It was this unique identifying number, the interment number, or in database lingo, the primary key, that was put on the original wooden headboards that first marked the graves in the soldier lot. When the headboards were replaced years later by the headstones, the federal authorities put names on the stones, but also got rid of the cemetery's interment numbers and put their own numbers on the stones, thereby reinforcing the separate status of the lot within the larger cemetery. Here again, the metadata we choose to display and the metadata we choose to conceal tell their own story. For the name to stay alive, the name alone is not enough, even if it is reconnected to the body in a proper individual grave. When the personal recollections of those who knew the name and the person are gone, the recorded metadata and the entire presentation scheme for that metadata takes the place of memory. In the GAR lot, the individual names have died because the organizational superstructure defining them has died. The names in the federal soldier lot live not because we know anything about them, but because they are attached to a huge, visually compelling superstructure of interpretation, which has become, in effect, their new metadata. This superstructure, as I have been arguing, defines each one of them as one of a national collective willing to fight and die in any war and any cause the nation decides. The actual texture of their lives and deaths, of their motivations and their hopes, has no place in this overarching structure of metadata. My talk has been about one response to the war's metadata crisis, the massive campaign to reattach names to bodies. I will conclude this evening by talking very briefly about the other side of the story, the deliberate detachment of names from bodies and their reattachment to public memorials that became, in effect, monumental archives of names. This process worked to transform the confused mass of names referred to in the New York Times, originally seen by the public in wartime newspapers, into well-ordered, elegant lists in bronze and stone on memorials in town greens, courthouse squares, and historic battlefields. While the bodies themselves were scattered and even lost, the names were concentrated in one place, one focal point for the community that recognized those names. Initially, these were local communities grieving over their sons and fathers and husbands, who were often lying in unmarked graves far from home. The monuments in the 1860s, 70s, and even into the 80s were often simply shafts or obelisks, a standardized form just enough to collect the names and give them a civic presence. Over time, however, as veterans groups became more organized and powerful, they began to take over this project, to expand it and to systematize it. Veterans Posts or their women's affiliates began to sponsor local monuments and to do the work of compiling and vetting the names. And the lists of names swelled to include not only the war dead, but survivors as well. As the veterans generation began to die off, these projects became increasingly urgent and ambitious, especially in my home state in Pennsylvania, where ever larger lists of names drove ever larger building projects. The numbers of names reached unheard of levels in the early 20th century, 26,000 names on a county level monument in Pittsburgh, just a few blocks from my office, 34,000 names on a state-level monument in Gettysburg, the Pennsylvania Memorial. At the time, these were the largest monumental lists of names anywhere in the world. These projects involved the conspicuous front-end work of building and decorating the monuments and enhancing them with sculpture, but equally important, the much more hidden back-end work of compiling the right names, filtering out the deserters and the dishonorably discharged, sorting those who were left into their regiments and the regiments into alphabetized lists. It was painstaking work that the veterans either did themselves or helped with, because the Army's own recruitment and record keeping were still decentralized. Once all this work came to fruition, the names had once again been put back into place, this time not the place of burial, nor typically the place of death, or even the place of residence in life. It was a civic place, as much abstract as real, where the names settled into alphabetical order in their old military units, which would now define the named men for all time by the few weeks or months or years they spent as soldiers. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial here in Washington is the supreme example in the US of a name-driven memorial, where small bits of text on stone have acquired a near mystical presence that not even the soldiers' graves have. In many ways, Myolin's format for the metadata reversed that of the federal gravestone and the public memorial. Unlike the raised letters on the marble tombstones in Allegheny Cemetery or on the bronze plaques in the Pennsylvania memorials, these names are marks cut below the polished, reflective surface of the granite, inviting a qualitatively different sensory engagement. The panels are also sunk below ground, as if guiding down into a metaphorical grave. And the ordering of the names on those panels is not by military unit, but by chronology, by the dates on which the dead were mortally wounded. They call the casualty date. Where more than one fell on the same date, the names are alphabetized, and in this way a history and scale of loss emerge over time. Lin's memorial thereby endows the names of the dead with a mysterious dual temporality. They are placed vividly in the here and now, immediately present to our touch and reflection, but at the same time situated in a history of loss that unfolds day by day across the surface of the wall. Recently, I was struck anew by this strange temporality when I came across a story about one particular photograph which had appeared in my book, Monument Wars. It caught the attention of one of the men in the picture when it was republished recently in the Memorial Fund's annual calendar. He wrote a letter to the fund explaining that he had taken a friend from his old unit to see Myolin's wall and, as he put it, to visit Jim. The friend had been right next to Jim when he died in combat on May 20th, 1969, and had never gotten over what he called the unbearable weight of survivor's guilt. The photograph here captures the precise moment of their encounter, their reunion, at panel 24W, line 61. He couldn't speak, the letter recounts. He simply put his hand on Jim's name engraved in the black granite and wept, and I put my hand over his to acknowledge that he was not alone in his grief. In this simple, potent image of one hand over another, over letters carved in stone, it becomes clear that the name ceases to be mere metadata and is transformed miraculously into something else, not the dead man himself or his ghost, but what Alfred Gell called a technology of enchantment. The carved names read like text on top of a page, but are literally dug beneath the surface, just as the reflections seem to hover on top of the stone, but also recede into its depths. It is this oscillation back and forth between worlds that creates the wall's magic, the feeling of a presence summoned from the past and entangled with us in the present. The latest turn in memorial practice is to supplement the monument's lists of names with a whole museum full of images and objects to personalize the names. Oklahoma City pioneered the approach, and it is continued through the September 11th Memorial Museum complexes in New York and Shanksville, and reached even Maya Lin's Memorial, with the Memorial Fund's plan to build a huge underground education center on the site nearby. Underlying all these projects is the fear that names alone will lose their potency, especially when the generation that knows them dies away. In the memorial museum paradigm, the names become metadata for virtual reliquaries of faces and memorabilia, while the overarching narrative connecting all these faces and objects together circles its way back eventually to a standardized story of national sacrifice and devotion. We have come a long way from the early days of the soldier cemetery. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was a desperate need to re-anchor names to bodies, to hold object and metadata together just to secure the identity of the dead. But once accomplished and made visible, every grave, every name posed a question. Was this one death worth the cause that demanded it? By a combination of necessity and design, visual regimes emerged to organize the bodies and their data and to give an answer to that question. Even though the nation made enormous efforts to get each body into an individual grave, the cemetery's artistic presentation and curation effectively erased the individual. The many complex causes of their deaths merged into a single, all-important national cause. The new memorial museum complexes seem at first glance to offer ever-expanding fields of information about the dead. Yet their own meta-narratives flatten the dead and their complex lives, just as the soldier lot in Allegheny Cemetery flattened the ground on which it was built. In the end, they all conscript the dead for their own purposes, to repeat the same story of sacrifice and redemption, or as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund explains on its website, the timeless story of patriotism from Bunker Hill to Baghdad. Lin's Wall does not attack this narrative, as her critics once claimed, but does in fact resist it. The genius of her design was to take mere metadata, the names of the dead, and use it to open up an enchanted space for reflection, however tenuous that is. As her memorial acknowledges, we all have our meta-narratives, our own versions of patriotism. We hear them every day all around us. It is easy to impose them on the dead because they can't talk back. It is harder to open up the spaces of the dead, to reckon honestly with their actual lives and aspirations. To honor the dead is to try to tell their story, not ours, as hard as that may be. They deserve it. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions, and I've been told to stay at the podium so that my voice doesn't go in and out. So I would love to walk around and interact with you a bit more, but I'm going to stay here, and I'm happy to field questions.
Show of hands. Yes, Monica. I think we have a microphone for you.
Thank you for your presentation. I was interested in another kind of image detached from a body or name in many cases, like the hundreds of tintypes that were made of soldiers prior to death and then have circulated widely since then. What would the role of something like that be in your system of metadata?
Well, that's a great question because, of course, this is the time period when those fairly inexpensive technologies of portraiture were first becoming really commercially viable, so that almost any soldier could get one, who drew his soldier pay. And so we do, in fact, this one example, the one reason I use the example of the photograph as an objects that often lose their metadata and the people in the photograph become unknown. And I have been thinking about that because you see so many. I mean, all you have to do is get on the Library of Congress website, or you just see hundreds of these photographs go by and have no idea who these people are, right? And so they are both stripped of their identities, but also typically buried away in archives. And now we can see them because of the internet. We now have a visibility for them that we didn't have before, and that we only had in places like soldier cemeteries, where we had, highly visible, either unknown graves or known graves. So I think it's an important question, and one which I should think about. I think about the circulation. Partly it has to do with the circulation of these photographs in that period of time, because again, we're dealing with a time now when these freely circulate. And I would be interested in being able to really learn more about the circulation of these images at the time that these cemeteries were being developed, in the 19th century, and what overlap, if any, there was between them.
Yes, Barbara.
Can I just project?
You discuss the value of remembering, and I'm struck by how much you want to recover and remember the lives of these soldiers. But what's the virtue, as Aristotle would say, of forgetting? Is there a virtue in forgetting?
Right. Well, and we all have to forget, right? I mean, so let's take the example of Camp Copeland. I mean, this was a terrible thing that happened there. It's been largely forgotten. It's not known to local people in Pittsburgh. It's not taught. It's not, it's something that I knew nothing about and stumbled across. And we could say, well, maybe it's better to just let that be and not remember it. But the problem with that, as I see it, is that there is no true forgetting, because if we don't remember these individuals, then another kind of memory takes over for them, and they become co-opted by collective memories that, as I say, kind of conscript them into a new narrative. So there's really the days of the kind of really abandonment of memory of these was really before the Civil War, when these bodies were lost and buried, by the side of the road somewhere, and nobody found them. And, there we have a much clearer case of oblivion happening. Now, if we talk to the family members and so on, I'm sure they were unhappy about that. This happened. This was the case routinely for, as I say, for slaves and paupers, and so on. And so now, there's a huge effort to try to recover some trace of those of these populations that never were remembered, who were so dishonored that they were thought to be seen just outside the sphere of memory. So it's hard, because I don't think we can really get away from, we can't get away from it. In our personal lives, there's obviously things that we need to forget. But I'm not sure the analogy extends to the nation.
Mabel.
And thank you for a really wonderful talk. And I guess my question is also somewhat about forgetting. And I was curious about whether or not you came across examples where groups, organizations were trying to rethink the question of decay. both of institutional decay, the fact that institutions disappear, but also the fact that materials also decay as well. And so if they were thinking about technologies of mass production of headstones, were they thinking about other materials besides stone that wouldn't decay as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting that they worked initially with marble. Let's just take the example of the material first, and then we'll go to the institutional decay as well, because both of these were issues that people certainly were aware of and saw coming. So with materials, gravestones were carved on marble because the tools that were available for granite, they really didn't exist at that point in the 1870s, the pneumatic tools that would become available later in the 19th century. And so you have an inherently very fragile medium, there that's going to erode and disappear. And they were very much aware of that, and they were very concerned about this sandblasting process for good reason, because the names did actually erode away. They didn't last that long, and then they had to replace, so there are these cycles of replacement. So with the federal government has the resources they were aware of this problem early on, and have adjusted by allowing for these enabling replacement of these stones so that they are sort of kept in some kind of sort of new condition all the time. And whereas what's so interesting is that the other organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic, or even the counties at the level of the local governments, which sometimes supplied gravestones for soldiers, this happened a lot. The Grand Army of the Republic actually went on this major campaign in the late 19th century to get local governments to pay for gravestones for its veterans. And so that was great, but the problem was that local government is never going to replace the gravestone. And you see what happened in the lot. They're just pushed down into the ground because this requires the maintenance of memory. It's a real maintenance, physical, logistical, financial process, economic process. So the GAR, I'm not a specialist in the history of the GAR, but I can tell you that they were, as the posts began to age, and as they began to think about, some of them began to think about ways to make their posts or their memories permanent in some way. And so we have a couple of examples of that, of posts that Grand Army of the Republic posts, for example, that were actually designed to outlive the actual members of the posts. And there's actually, I hate to harp on Pittsburgh all the time, but Pittsburgh is an incredible place for stuff like this. There's an intact Grand Army of the Republic post in Pittsburgh with relics in it, which is unbelievable. Any of you go to Pittsburgh, you've got to go to this place because it is unique, right? But that's sort of the exception, so largely I think it was kind of, it's sort of the same issue that you face if you're getting old and you're thinking about dying, and what are you going to leave your children, or what, are you going to write your memories down? Are you going to write these are the kinds of issues, and most people just didn't get around to it. And the stuff disappeared.
Maybe one more question. Mary.
Would there have been a considerable difference between what happened between the situation of the GAR and the Confederacy, and how they were buried, and what responsibility, if any, did either the state governments or the federal government take for those dead?
There was a massive campaign on the Confederate side. I didn't talk about it as much because I'm really focused on the federal system. But the case of Thomas Sly is the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, there were massive repatriation campaigns going on. Charleston, the cemetery in Charleston, Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and other places where bodies were collected. And this was an effort that was done largely outside of state structures, largely done by these associations, and largely done by ladies' memorial associations. But they were actively in the field and trying to do a kind of comprehensive job of it. And then eventually, as the lost cause became more and more powerful, as the Reconstruction governments in the South were overturned and so on, and white supremacy reestablished itself, then they had a platform from which to actually lobby the federal government to get involved. And that happened towards the very end of the 19th century, is when the federal government began, and I forget the exact year, but it's right around the turn of the century, when it was decided that Confederate soldiers could get federal headstones as well. And so it's 1907 when we see, I think it was 1906 when that legislation was passed. So 1907 is when we see those CSA gravestones appearing in the Union lot for that reason. And that was, of course, very controversial, very, very controversial, especially among the GAR. The GAR hated this idea. Yeah.
Kirk, I feel that we could keep you here
Yeah.
for a very long time, and we should perhaps allow the questions to continue outside the lecture hall.
Sure.
But thank you so much. Thank you very, very much.